At 4:37 in the morning in Los Angeles, California, a heavily guarded estate held a clergyman under strict observation. Concealed smuggling corridors exposed the most startling religious-based exploitation breach in the history of the state. Please press the like button to help this reality reach a larger audience effectively. As you are likely aware, millions of individuals are currently pouring into our country across the southern border. That is not entirely accurate anymore, as no one enters now. Yet under the Biden administration, 25 million people arrived. They originated from penitentiaries and psychiatric wards, including narcotics dealers and various others who simply should not be here. 23 minors were discovered trapped inside a $2 million estate concealed behind sermons and holy verses. This location was not a sanctuary for a cartel, but rather a clergyman's residence transformed into a detention center. This situation did not represent an external danger, but rather a profound betrayal cloaked in religious devotion. If you wish to witness the true depth of this criminal web, we are about to delve further. It was still pitch black in Los Angeles at 4:37 a.m. when high-powered beams lit up a luxury home on a hill. Officially, the deeds listed Pastor Abdi Hirsi, a Somali-American born within the United States, as the owner. From afar, the site appeared to be a location of prayer and peace. However, upon closer inspection, the grounds looked more like a military fortification. Approximately 30 armed private security contractors walked the property around the clock. Video surveillance systems monitored every single ingress point available. Sensors designed to detect movement were placed strategically all along the outer boundary lines. This was certainly not the home of a minister, but rather a defensive tactical compound. When the command was finally given, the FBI and Homeland Security initiated their movements in unison. The entry was instantaneous and forceful, as steel barriers gave way and diversionary grenades shattered the quiet. Security personnel fired back from behind stone barricades, while federal agents moved forward in organized formations. With ballistic shields raised, their voices cut sharply through the drifting smoke and ringing echoes. The firefight continued for only a few minutes before the defending force was completely neutralized. Pastor Abdi Hirsi was apprehended within the primary residence while trying to delete encrypted files. Nearby, federal officers discovered nearly 50 high-caliber firearms and shipping logs connected to brutal smuggling rings. They subsequently breached a secured outbuilding located at the far perimeter of the garden area. Inside that structure were 23 minors, and not a single one was over the age of 10. In that specific instant, the raid transformed from an assault into a recovery mission. Please comment the word SAVE if you believe that no minor should ever be concealed behind walls of influence. Over the preceding 18 months, more than 40 youths from small congregations throughout Los Angeles County had disappeared completely. There were no demands for money, no signs of break-ins, and no remains ever found. Parents recounted the exact same moment of utter bewilderment regarding the events. One day, their offspring attended church functions, and by the following day, they simply failed to return home. Every single incident appeared unconnected, involving different residential areas, distinct families, and varying situations. That changed when detectives cross-referenced the information and found nearly every lost child had visited the same chapel. They had all sat through services conducted by the same individual, Pastor Abdi Hirsi. To the local families, he appeared to be a quiet, convincing, and highly regarded figure. He frequently preached about the importance of self-control, spiritual belief, and divine safety. He extended assistance to overwhelmed parents by offering temporary supervision, spiritual guidance, and secure environments for kids. While these families labored for long hours, There was never any aggression or intimidation, only reliance. That specific reliance became the tool used against them effectively. Parents were informed that their offspring would remain overnight for prayer sessions or spiritual lessons. Some were guaranteed academic opportunities, while others were told their kids were training for missionary service. No administrative documents triggered any warnings, and no formal grievances were ever submitted because nobody suspected wrongdoing. Investigators discovered that a minimum of 41 minors entered Hersey's care through church-sponsored events. 23 individuals were rescued alive at the estate, but the remainder had been silently extracted from the network. There were no academic transcripts, no records of doctor visits, and absolutely no online activity trails. To the general public, these young individuals had quite literally vanished into thin air. What families trusted as a sanctuary had transformed into a regulated processing center. It was a mechanism engineered to transport minors without coercion, without observers, and lacking any opposition. By the conclusion of the assessment, federal agents arrived at one singular determination. The estate served as the detention center, but the chapel was the location where everything originated. If this information startled you, it certainly should have. Please comment, "Protect children," if you hold the belief that religion should never be utilized as a tool for harm. The mission did not roll out like a wave, but rather unfolded like a series of cracks. Rather than one massive shove, Command approved calculated ignition spots, which were small, aggressive breaks throughout California. These were intended to force the syndicate inward before it had any chance to flee. Every tactical unit operated on individual timelines, unaware of exactly when the other teams would attack. Absolute silence was the primary tool used. At 5:19 in the morning, the initial breach struck a supply depot near the Port of Los Angeles. The structure masqueraded as a bonded storage facility, but inside, sentries tried to burn the computer servers. Gunshots broke out in the darkness as muzzle flares flickered rapidly through the haze. Agents moved forward by listening, holding shields close while boots slid on the slick, spilled fuel. 2 sentries were incapacitated, while 3 others gave up, and the fire never fully ignited. 4 minutes afterward in San Bernardino, a tactical column approached an unmarked facility that shouldn't have existed there. There were no signs and no licenses, yet armed individuals flooded out of the side exits. They attempted to flee into the neighboring desert parcels. An aircraft descended to a low altitude, its blades whipping the dirt into blinding dust storms. Agents navigated through the turmoil, taking down suspects mid-stride and securing firearms before safety latches were released. Then, the situation in Fresno exploded violently. What appeared to be a refrigerated warehouse resisted the assault like a military bunker. Automatic weapon fire tore through the thin metal siding. One officer was knocked to the ground by a ricocheting bullet. Squads adjusted immediately, using breaching explosives on the loading bays and moving through freezer hallways. Flash grenades exploded and the firing ceased, while inside a concealed room, detectives discovered partially destroyed manifests. San Diego happened last and was the most intense encounter. A residential neighborhood exploded into chaos when an entryway was blasted inward and gunmen fired from the stairs. The civilians in the area were still sleeping soundly. Orders were given in whispers rather than shouts because accuracy was critical. Agents moved forward inch by inch, firing to suppress rather than spray, compelling surrender instead of increasing violence. Within less than 8 minutes, the entire block had fallen silent. Throughout the state, 17 separate sites were struck. Some locations collapsed immediately, while others resisted until they physically could not anymore. By the time the sun rose, 36 suspects were detained. Currency was piled high on examination tables in the millions. Weapons were catalogued, and phones vibrated with unanswered texts. However, it was the documentation that fundamentally altered the situation. The accounting books recorded the transit of people rather than merchandise. Dates, specific paths, transfers, and billing codes were all listed. Several line items were designated as finalized, while others bore timestamps for the future. This was not a cleanup operation, but rather a disruption. Operations centers gazed at the charts as the marker pins increased in number. The configuration was undeniable and clear to everyone watching. California was not a central hub, but rather a passageway and a proving ground. It was merely one section of an apparatus engineered to transport humans as silently as narcotics. By the moment the final squad stood down, one reality was blatantly obvious. The raid on the estate revealed the offense, but this night revealed the magnitude. Whatever was approaching next would definitely not be restricted by state borders. What you have just witnessed was not disorder, but rather coordination under hostile fire. Please keep viewing and comment "Stand with FBI" if you back federal officers hazarding their lives to halt smuggling rings. The statewide assaults resolved one query, but simultaneously unlocked a much more sinister one. As proof gathered from all over California was aggregated, researchers observed something disturbing. The pathways, payment hierarchies, and safety procedures were not made up on the spot. They were completely standardized across the board. Every single ledger adhered to the exact same layout. Every money transfer utilized the identical encrypted terminology. Every consignment, whether marked as electronics, fabric, or humanitarian aid, traveled based on matching timeframes. This was not a regional illicit group adjusting as they went along. This was an imported methodology. Financial experts tracked electronic transfers through tiers of shell corporations incorporated in numerous nations. Contributions from faith-based nonprofits blended with supply chain payments. Transport costs were divided, cleaned, and put back together before vanishing abroad. When the trail of funds was ultimately rebuilt, it indicated a single origin over and over again. The Afghan narcotics syndicates were responsible. These networks function far beyond the stereotypical visual of poppy fields and mules. Headquartered principally in Afghanistan, they manage one of the biggest heroin and opium manufacturing apparatuses on Earth. Government calculations indicate that more than 80% of the globe's illegal opium comes from areas they sway. However, narcotics represent only a fraction of their business holdings. The identical corridors that transport drugs also transport human beings. Detectives verified that these cartels operate as hybrid entities. They are partially a smuggling syndicate and partially a paramilitary organization. They depend on strict obedience, separation of duties, and total quiet. Individual cells do not understand the entire web, and assets are considered expendable. Loyalty is mandated through intimidation and financial incentives. Abdi Hirsi fit flawlessly into that specific arrangement. He was not a commander, but rather an enabler. His function was processing and hiding. Using his spiritual standing, he pinpointed susceptible households. He obtained temporary guardianship without pushback and detained the minors until movement orders came through. The estate was not a final stop, but a holding zone. It was a location where human freight could be kept until global paths were deemed safe. Transport papers retrieved during the assaults verified international collaboration. Containers were marked for expedited customs processing. Cargo weights were deliberately recorded incorrectly. Certain consignments left American harbors under humanitarian waivers. Others were directed through intermediary nations before vanishing into war zones where supervision ceased to exist. Even more alarming were intelligence connections binding these cartel webs to militant extremist factions. Although not every mission involved political beliefs, revenue from drugs and smuggling regularly funded arms buying. It also supported training facilities and the funding of insurgents. Every miner transported was not just an offense, it was financial capital. For federal leadership, the consequences were instant and grave. This was no longer merely a domestic smuggling investigation. It was a homeland security danger entrenched within civilian systems. It existed in chapels, nonprofits, harbors, and supply lines, places built to be relied upon. Experts briefed the command staff with a bleak deduction. Eliminating Abdi Hirsi would not deconstruct the apparatus. At very best, it would only decelerate it. The syndicate's framework was durable by intention. It was capable of substituting nodes, redirecting funds, and restarting activities within weeks. That understanding altered the entire mission. What started as a recovery effort had now transitioned into counter-network combat. The goal was no longer merely detentions, but rather revelation and interruption. It involved cutting the monetary and logistical veins that kept the engine running. For the first time, federal bureaus admitted the reality they could no longer overlook. The miners in Los Angeles were not an anomaly. They were components of a worldwide supply chain. This was not a neighborhood felony anymore, but a planetary pipeline. If you wish to comprehend how deep this web goes, remain with us. The questioning of Pastor Abdi Hirsi did not commence with yelling. It started with absolute silence in a guarded federal chamber hours after the assault. Hirsi sat motionless with hands clasped and eyes focused on the desk. He did not request an attorney right away. He did not refute the accusations. He comprehended something that the agents already realized. Denial would be entirely useless. When the inquiries began, they were very specific regarding names, dates, and places. Initially, Hirsi spoke only in broken sentences. He portrayed his function as purely clerical. He asserted that he merely supplied provisional housing. He maintained that the youths were secure while they remained under his roof. However, when officers laid pictures on the surface, his demeanor shifted. Cargo logs, encrypted account books, and surveillance photos from harbors and depots caused the narrative to fall apart. Hirsi confessed he was compensated to detain children, not forever, but until the paths opened. His task was to keep them concealed, silent, and without papers. No academies, no medical centers, and no digital footprints were allowed. Minors who could not be located could not be tracked. He detailed how the directions were received. Orders never came directly, but arrived through middlemen via coded texts and financial signals. When money arrived in particular ledgers, it signified that transport was impending. When payments ceased, it signified a postponement. According to his testimony, at least 9 miners had already been moved out of California prior to the assault. He asserted they were transported in phases. First, they went to interior staging areas, then towards harbors or land borders using fake aid documents. He stated he never inquired where they eventually ended up. But the archives did. Agents from the Bureau presented the proof item by item. Freight timetables corresponded with payment times. Automobile GPS records lined up with church activity schedules. Contributions marked as philanthropic aid were transformed into shipping costs within hours. The most unsettling instant arrived when Hirsi was shown a notebook page stamped with red icons. Those signs, the experts clarified, signified finished transactions. Hirsi then averted his gaze and spoke softly. Those specific ones are not returning. The extent of the operation grew quickly. Utilizing Hersey's assistance, detectives charted a web extending far past California. There were safe houses in adjacent states, supply partners near docks, and money managers planted in legal firms. Not one of them understood the complete image. Each person knew only enough to execute their specific duty. That was the intentional architecture. What astounded detectives the most was how normal the system appeared from the exterior. Churches supplied the entry, charities supplied the disguise, and freight firms supplied the transport. Not a single exchange seemed illegal on its own. Only when stacked atop one another did the felony become apparent. By the conclusion of the intelligence reviews, leadership squads were compelled to face a harsh truth. Even with detentions and confiscations, the web remained operational. Paths could be diverted, money could be replenished, and new enablers could be hired. Hersey had not built the machine. He had merely managed one of its entryways. As agents finished their dossiers, one deduction solidified across every conference room. The miners saved in Los Angeles were merely beneficiaries of good timing. Others had already moved beyond recovery. Halting what was left would demand far more than just jail time. It would necessitate deconstructing the apparatus that made vanishing feasible initially. Some solutions arrived too late. If you believe mechanisms that delete children must be taken apart, press like to keep this narrative visible. The detentions did not bring finality. They brought immediate pressure. As summaries from questioning and assaults were gathered, federal command arrived at a somber realization. Eliminating Abdi Hersey and his California ring had interrupted the stream. However, it had not ceased it. Too many monetary conduits were still functioning. Too many pathways remained unexplained. The engine had been injured, not destroyed. Within 48 hours, the matter was escalated above a typical smuggling inquiry. Combined task forces grew under the direction of the FBI. They brought in global allies, harbor officials, financial fraud squads, and anti-terror researchers. New orders were distributed effectively. Track the funds ahead, not behind. Pursuit substitute operations, not just the revealed origins. What detectives dreaded started to manifest almost instantly. Shell profiles linked to Hersey went silent. However, parallel profiles became active elsewhere. Freight timetables altered names but not their patterns. Nonprofits dissolved legally and then reappeared under fresh incorporations. The web was evolving in real time. Researchers pinpointed at least 6 new enablers stepping into positions left empty by the arrests. None of them possessed criminal histories. Several occupied esteemed roles in civic groups. One was employed within a certified supply chain company. Another managed a faith-based charity less than 50 miles from the first church. This was not happenstance. It was deliberate backup planning. Field units carried out subsequent missions silently. There was no media and no showmanship. Monetary seizures were ranked higher than detentions, intending to starve the flow before it could regroup. Harbors ramped up examinations under crisis powers. Freight previously passed without inspection was now stopped, slowed, and taken apart. Yet the most difficult portion remained unsolved. Regarding the children transported prior to the Los Angeles assault, some were found months later alive. They were concealed in isolated areas and too frightened to speak up. Others were never located at all. Intelligence indicated transfers into war zones where archives did not exist and observers did not live. Relatives were informed with caution. Some obtained closure, while others received only likelihoods. For the officers involved, the assignment left a lasting scar. Many had joined law enforcement expecting to face aggression in clear shapes. They expected firearms, narcotics, and mobs. Very few were ready for a structure that turned reliance, religion, and standard documentation into weapons to erase lives quietly. The concluding briefings did not finish with declarations of victory. They finished with cautions. The framework that permitted this ring to function still persists. Congregations still assemble minors. Nonprofits still transfer funds. Supply lines still traverse boundaries faster than regulations can keep up. What shifted was the level of knowledge. But knowledge by itself does not disassemble a machine, constructed to outlast revelation. As task groups stayed busy and global tips kept appearing, one fact steered every active mission. This was never merely regarding a single minister, one estate, or one specific state. It was regarding a methodology. It is one that can resurface anywhere. Reliance goes unchallenged and travel goes uninspected. The pursuit proceeded, not as a solitary event, but as a permanent assignment. Because somewhere past the final RAID chart, the web was already attempting to reconstruct, and this time federal bureaus planned to be ready. The detentions generated news stories, but the technique endured. What occurs subsequently is significant. The inquiry did more than reveal a smuggling ring. It compelled the country to face a reality many chose to disregard. When religion is abused and authority goes unsupervised, evil can expand in locations never designed to contain it. But the teaching was not regarding spirituality itself. It was regarding the persons who turned it into a weapon. Pastor Abdi Hirsi did not symbolize Christianity, nor the numerous ministers who truly defend their flocks. He symbolized something much older and far more perilous. It is the manipulation of reliance for individual profit. Throughout history, illicit rings have utilized governance, nonprofits, and even faith as containers. This is because humans naturally drop their defenses around organizations designed to lead and defend them. The Afghan cartel agents who operated through him had no interest in homilies or verses. They were interested in entry. They valued access to households, to minors, to paperwork, and to judicial protections. They wanted the believability that chapels, charities, and civic initiatives inherently possess. When a structure is founded on reliance, the danger originates not from the structure itself, but from those who penetrate it. Federal experts stated that Hirsi's ring functioned silently for years because people paused before doubting a spiritual leader. They paused before doubting a charity. They paused before doubting a person of counsel. And in the realm of syndicated felony, hesitation is oxygen. Officers stress that this dossier is not a denouncement of religion. It is a prompt that faith devoid of responsibility becomes susceptible. Governance without supervision becomes sightless. Neighborhoods without watchfulness become marks. And the children were never casualties of spirituality. They were casualties of people who concealed themselves behind spirituality, realizing society would pause before looking too deeply. As the federal unit spread across the country, chapels and groups started enacting tougher safeguards. These included history screenings, reviews, independent supervision, minor protection rules, and instant notification tools. This is not because religion is hazardous, but because reliance must be guarded, not taken for granted. In their closing summary, federal leaders reiterated a statement that has resonated through every major mission since. Organizations worthy of belief are robust enough to be interrogated. This dossier becomes more than a news item. It becomes a tutorial. It is a tutorial on watchfulness, on civic duty, and on declining to allow icons of optimism to be warped into covers for abuse. And most importantly, it is a tutorial on listening when something feels incorrect. Even when the individual liable wears a vestment, holds a rank, or speaks the dialect of virtue, If you believe guarding minors must always supersede guarding reputations, comment protect the innocent. If you believe religion should never be a sanctuary for felony, comment truth over power. And if you believe narratives like this must continue to be revealed, press like and subscribe, so this broadcast reaches more individuals who need to listen.